from Kathleen Koch, and she wrote this on the back cover of the book. She said, Tim Isbell's photographs are a love letter to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I would have to agree with her. This book is about home. Even though I was born and raised in Jackson and have cherished memories of living here, the past 35 years of my life has been on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And most of those years I was working for the Sun-Herald newspaper, so I was one of a staff of 5 photographers who served as the eyes and ears of the coast. And I took that charge very seriously. I wanted to, when I first started at the Sun-Herald, it was 2 papers. It was the Daily Herald and the Sun. And that makes me a dinosaur now, because when I tell the young crowd that at the paper now, they just sort of look at me and say what? But sure enough, we had a morning paper and afternoon paper, and when I got there, we even had a TV station. So we were pretty cutting edge at that point, because I don't think too many papers at that time had a TV station also. But this book, just like all the others, is my book. Usually most things that really stick with you in life comes from like some sort of life-altering experience. Easily said, the life-altering experience for this book was Hurricane Katrina. And I go out, I get to my house. Luckily, I was one of the few people who still had a house. I had 4 live oak trees on the roof, but the house was still standing under it. But I remember standing in my yard saying, how do we ever rebuild? How do we ever recover? And then I go see Biloxi and Gulfport and, every city, and I just kept saying, how do we ever recover? And for the longest time, my whole career, my camera was my shield. As long as I had the camera up, I was thinking about composition and exposure and what my subject matter was and so forth. And I would cry afterwards, but not while I was working. A lot of pictures I took during Katrina, tears were just coming down my face. And I'll get through this. That's primarily because it was home. Even if I didn't know the person, it was their home. It was my home. So that one hit pretty well. It hit real close to home. And I always say to this day that Katrina is like a scab that won't heal. There's something that will always trigger a memory. For me, it's, believe it or not, it's the smell of peanut butter. Because at the Sun-Herald, Knight Ridder came in, our parent paper, and they had all great support. But for weeks, we were eating non-perishable meals, which usually meant peanut butter. Well, after we got back in our homes and our lives sort of got back semi-normal, you could not put peanut butter in front of me. I just hated it. It took about 5 years before I would eat peanut butter after Katrina. So, one of my triggers for Katrina is peanut butter. So I wouldn't be a good spokesman for the peanut butter industry. So you deal with that, and one of the ways I dealt with Katrina, because, my job as a photojournalist, I'm out there showing the death and destruction and misery, and it's every day was this great big downer. The only positive thing you were getting was your friends were okay, and the people of the coast were so resilient that you knew we would rebuild, whether it took 10 years or 50 years, it didn't matter. You knew we would rebuild. So you took strength from that. People wanted to tell you their stories. So you couldn't just swim in on an assignment, get a quick shot and leave. They wanted to tell you, I lost this picture of my grandmother and so on and so forth. So it was, you were carrying a lot of the people's burdens on your shoulder as you did your job. And my therapy for that, and as I said, when President Bush came down, I was part of the White House press pool. And you can see what it looked like through my cameras of President Bush's visit. What you didn't see was while he was visiting people in East Biloxi, they were still removing bodies. You would see a truck go by and it would have a body in it as President Bush was walking around. And to me, that just sort of underscored the seriousness of what was going on. And I was in the presidential motorcade, and we're rushing down Highway 90, and you have this moment you don't see this everyday moment, and there's a casino barge sitting on the middle of Highway 90 in Biloxi. And this man steps out almost as if on cue as the motorcade passes. He steps out from behind the barge. He probably hasn't had a bath in about a week. He's grimy, he's filthy, and he just has no expression on his face. And to me, that was the coast. Everybody walked around like a zombie for I don't know how long, because you just could not imagine what Mother Nature did to us. So I grew tired of that. I just wanted something positive in my life. And other than my wife and son, there wasn't much positive going on at that point. So once they took the razor wire down, I wanted to go to the beach and shoot sunrises, because I did that for my previous books. And I love just sitting out there alone and at times having my own little intimate conversation with God and so forth, that it was relaxing for me. And so I wanted to go to the beach. So once, even though I was within walking distance of the beach, I couldn't get to it because they had razor wire at the railroad track, and there was a National Guardsman with the M16. And even though I had a press badge that would have gotten me past that, I didn't want to abuse that. I mean, if my neighbor couldn't go to the beach, I wasn't going to go to the beach if I wasn't working. And so once they removed that, I started going out and taking pictures at sunrise. And at first, it was just therapy for me. It was no book in mind. It was just trying to get rid of a little bit of the negative and have a little positive influence. And my therapy, I would put a few pictures on social media, because I had friends always asking, how are you doing after Katrina? And Judy, as always, was seeing my pictures, and she's the one that suggested that I do a book. She was the one that suggested I do my first book, so I usually do what Judy says, and good things happen. So gave birth to this book, and I'm very proud to say that this book is totally, without a doubt, found moments. There's no setup, there's nothing, me telling someone to walk on the beach, anything that has a person in it, they just happen to be in the picture when I shot it. And that calls for a lot of patience. You know, a lot of time in the journalism business, you hit it fast. Other times you get to spend some time on it, but this was go out 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, spend some time, come back, and feel revitalized. And I always, even from my Civil War, when we talked about doing a book, everybody would say, how can you do a book on the coast? Because I think General Honore said at one point it looked like a bomb had gone off, and it did. So everybody says, how can you do a book on the coast? Because it looks destroyed. And I kept falling back on the fact that I made Civil War battlefields where thousands of people died look beautiful. So to me, it wasn't beyond the pale to make the coast look beautiful again. And it was just a little creative cropping before you take the picture and so forth. And as I said in a recent interview, everybody who knows me knows I'm a big Doobie Brother fan. And there's a line from a song that says, people rushing everywhere, if they only slowed down once, they might find something there. Well, a lot of these pictures I'm taking on Highway 90, you can hear the traffic just buzzing by. And I'm taking this beautiful 30-second exposure of something, and you're wondering if they're actually seeing what I'm seeing, because what I'm seeing made me stop and take pictures. So this book is, as I said on the interview, is me slowing down and actually taking the time to appreciate what's in front of me. And it was a great book to do. This book is basically a promise. During Katrina, I promised myself that, at least for my images of Katrina would not be what the coast looks like. I know you have to show that as a journalist, you show the good, bad, and the ugly. But I wanted my lasting images of the Mississippi Gulf Coast to be more than a destroyed land. I wanted to show, those of you old enough to remember, Camille, the signature photo was an American flag flying on a bent flagpole. And to me, that picture represented hope and determination that we're going to rebuild. So I would always try to look for pictures like that. I remember I shot a picture of a single solitary flag in Long Beach. The flag's ripped, starting to shred, but it's still flying. There's nothing around it. The building where this flag was is totally gone. It's just a foundation. And when Haley Barbour wrote his book about his Katrina experiences, that picture I'm describing is the cover of his book. And the picture on the back of the book is he and Marsha looking at all the destruction. And I shot that during the time of President Bush's visit. So, as my friends at University Press will know, I gave them a book that was too big to publish. I think it probably was 300 pages, maybe more. And so I had to cut it down at their urging. And it just so happened I was going to be up here for a certain concert with my favorite singing group. And before I came up here, I did what I called Tim Isbell's ruthless edit. And I knocked about 80 to 90 pictures out of this book. And we got it down to the page limit that was best for University Press to publish. So, you know, they always say in whether you're editing copy or editing pictures, you edit till you hurt. And I was hurting those 2 days, but I think it's a better book because I did edit to the point of pain. And it made a stronger picture. There's always some sort of repetition that you get into the pictures if you're shooting sunsets and sunrises and so forth. Judy's a great editor. I won't let an ounce of copy come out of the house until Judy reads it. And she's very used to me calling her into the bedroom and saying, "What do you think about this?" And it's looking at a picture, and she'll give a yes or no. And it helps having that audience that's someone other than you, because as a photographer, you develop what I call sacred cows. You fall in love with the picture, and you're not going to take it out come hell or high water, but it helps to have another person say yes, no, or what were you thinking? And she has said that a lot too. I've had people ask me, to the point back in the Civil War books to this book, they say, how do you get the beautiful pictures? And I'm a big fan of Ansel Adams, and he has a famous quote that says, the most important part of the camera is 6 inches behind it. And I fully believe that. I think sometimes those of us who have been doing photography all our lives, we make it look too easy. And even if you're shooting a press conference or trying to emulate Ansel Adams, what's going on in your mind is so much more than what it looks like. You're thinking composition, how do I want selective focus or real tight focus, so on and so forth. And I can't explain to you while I'm doing it what all that's going on in my head. But believe me, every photographer I know is thinking it through big time. But to answer the people's question when they say, how do you get the pretty pictures? I always say God provides the subject matter, light and color. I provide the composition and exposure. And on this book, I think we made a pretty good collaboration together. And having seen the coast destroyed, it's so nice to see the coast getting whole again. And I try to remember, especially on these days when the sunrise just almost buckles your knee, it's so beautiful, that I look up to the heavens and say thank you, because I've seen the alternative. And I hope I don't see it again in my lifetime. For Judy Switch, can you go back? This is you take advantage of what God gives you. The river was flooded that day to the point that it covered up the walkway. And with the water over the walkway and the water was still, it was like a reflective mirror. And if I was working for the Sun Herald that day, I would have been hanging around until someone walked on the walkway. I would be putting a person in the picture. But since it was a me picture, that was good enough for me. It's Friendship Oak in Long Beach. And I'm big on reflections. Usually if you're walking around on the beach, any pool of water that's not necessarily getting hit by the surf will form a reflective pool. So then you just get down low and you can get sky top and bottom. And even though the book's done, anyone who follows me on social media knows that I can be found probably tomorrow morning or Friday morning somewhere on the coast around sunrise trying to find another beautiful picture. And I live in a good place for it. I mean, the area is so open that it's hard not to get a good picture. If you've ever been to St. Rose de Lima, that's the mural behind the choir. Just very striking. And before I sort of close for today, as always, I'm working on another project. My old boss, Vernon Matthews, used to fuss at me and say that I should stop and smell the roses every once in a while because before I would finish a project, I would start another one, sometimes 3. And he used to sort of say, slow down and smell the roses every once in a while. Well, my next project is a project on civil rights site locations in Mississippi. And much like my Civil War books, I'll let you catch up with me. She's clicking as fast as she can.
I don't want him to miss anything.
Well, I'll talk about it while Judy's clicking, but if you've ever seen my Civil War books, it's a photo and a story beside the photo, and it's about a location, or you have historic monuments that sort of tells the story too. So I try to tell everybody that story of what happened there. And I'm going to do the Sentinel's treatment to civil rights locations because there's so many. I always call the civil rights movement, Jim Crow and so forth, Mississippi's second Civil War because we seem to be at war with ourselves. And, you can walk past the Greyhound bus station here in Jackson, unless you know the history of it, it's just a Greyhound bus station. But if you know the history of it, that's where the Freedom Riders came in. Or that's the cover that I'm working on right now, and you can't tell civil rights story in Mississippi without Medgar Evers. And I actually went to 5th grade at Bradley Elementary, which is walking distance to Medgar's house. In fact, today there's a statue of Medgar Evers pretty much in front of the school. So I chose Oh Freedom. First I had Let Freedom Ring as the tentative title to the book. And the more research I did on Medgar, Oh Freedom was one of the songs that was sung at his funeral. And I just thought that was a perfect title for the book. So I've been going around taking pictures throughout my home state, and I want to tell these stories. Some of these stories, just like Civil War, are hard to read. I mean, there's hatred and blood and guts, whatever you want to call it, and there's determination too. This picture right here, I read a story, I think, in the Clarion Ledger. When Medgar Evers came here to see the museum, she said the first thing she looked at when she went to the exhibit with the rifle was the trigger. The fact that that's sort of the last thing a living person did to kill her husband was to pull that trigger. So once again, to me, this is photographer thinking. After reading Merle's description of what she looked at, when I took the picture to write the story, basically about the trigger being pulled, I didn't need to show the whole gun. All I needed was the trigger and the scope. So I sat through the exhibit like 3 times to get this picture because I wanted to make darn sure, since I lived 3 hours away, that I got that image. When I was working at the Sun Herald, I actually came up here to do a crime story. And me and the cops riding around late at night, and he said, "You want to go anywhere?" And me being the history nut, I said, "Take me to Medgar's house." And I said, "I want to know where the guy was that pulled the trigger." And now there's like a tree that would block his vision of that. And, you know, you just wondered if that tree was there all those years ago, what would have happened. But I've never been inside that house. I want to go inside one day. But it just, I don't know. I'm glad it made didn't it recently make the historic? I'm glad it did. So I'm hoping, with my experience with University Press, that one day I'll finish this book. I'll get with my friends there, and maybe in a few years I'll come to you and talk about my latest book, which will be, at that point, Oh Freedom. But as it is, the work on the Mississippi Gulf Coast has been probably my most favorite book to do. And I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is home. And I feel, if you can ask Judy, I know the coast like the back of my hand. I don't have to go to the main routes. I know every pig trail and back road there is on the Gulf Coast. And you tend to find things on those. I went on an assignment one time with one of the younger guys at Sun Herald, and instead of turning left out of the parking lot to go to the interstate, I turned right to go to the beach. And he said, "You know," he goes, you can get to it by going on the interstate. And I said, "Yeah, I know that." I said, "How many stories have you found on the interstate going 80 miles an hour?" And I said, "I go to back roads." This book, future book, there's been times where I've felt a little uneat ease when I took the picture, and this was one of them. This is the Bryant Grocery at Money. And, you know, I'm native-born Mississippian, and I'm standing there taking pictures, and it's almost like I'm standing on the moon. There's no one around me. And the next thing I know, there's a car speeding by, and I get a few expletives hurled my way, probably because I'm standing there with cameras. And he shows me who's number one and all that stuff, and he tells me to go home. And I just wanted to shout back and say, "Mississippi is my home." But I sort of got my picture and got out of there that day. And this is in Jackson. I think it's at the COFO office. And I don't know, it's sort of a good thing to end on. I think we are whether it's a state or a country, I think we're much stronger when we're together than we're divided. I think Lincoln proved that. But I appreciate you guys coming in, talking, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. He's going to get you.
Wonderful pictures.
Thank you.
Will the civil rights book include Gulfside at Waveland?
I'm trying to figure out a picture for it
Okay.
because it is basically
Gone.
gone.
Yeah. But they have archival pictures.
Yeah.
And the grave of Bishop Jones is still there.
Is it still there?
The gravestone, and that spot did survive Katrina.
That is a challenge, you know, with Katrina. So much of our history was wiped away. I think after the storm, I said other than the lighthouse, I think our history just got wiped away. Anything older than Beauvoir stood. And God bless the federal government, because I don't think they would have ever rebuilt it if it was not for the federal government coming in and say, well, we will rebuild it, and we will rebuild it right, because they wanted everything historically significant. So I think they actually made it a better place to visit if you're a history buff. Oh, he walked away from me.
One of your, is this one working?
Yeah.
One of your early pictures is of a Coca-Cola sign. It says, "Drink refreshing Coca-Cola, 5 cents."
Uh-huh.
Is that sign still there?
That's the night exposure in Bay St. Louis. I think it's like second, I can't remember the name of the store, but it is still there. Drove past it 2 weeks ago. I think Rogelio was.
Couple questions. First one is, at your LOX interview, you noted that it's completely digital, but you use some manual lenses. Did you notice much difference in quality in what you shot now as versus what you shot for your previous books?
Not as long as I got it in focus. Any fallback was on me. You know, being 57, the eyes aren't what they used to be. But no, I could see the same thing. In my Civil War books, I did film and digital. And I can tell the difference in those just because of the grain that you would see on a negative versus a digital image. But although back then, when digital first started, some of their pictures looked like sandpaper if you were shooting low light.
You also shot Bryant's grocery store, which is now completely covered with vines and trees and all. Is there any? Are you going to make any attempt to go back to some of these places and shoot from when maybe you shot that?
Yeah,
You know?
I was telling Judy we need to do a Delta vacation, and I'm a terrible person to bring you on vacation because it's usually going to be something to do with history. So it's you might learn something, but you know, seeing the finer points in life, I don't know. But yeah, I will, because when I went to Ruralville, the Fannie Lou Hamer statue was not up yet, and all they had was the grave that said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," which I wanted to get that, but I think there's a statue of her now where like she's giving a speech and really getting into it, and I would love to shoot that with a sort of a mean sky behind her, and that would be fun.
Thank you so much. Such beautiful pictures, such beautiful exposures.
Thank you.
My question is, this museum, your opinion, please. This museum was put here for a purpose of healing the state of Mississippi as a whole, and the truth hurts. There are so many truths that have not been told, and it's just, you mentioned the Civil War several times. Is the Civil War still being fought? Because the historians said that those who, the slave masters left the state of Mississippi, left the South, and when the Civil War was over, they came back to design another system to replace the old system. With all of the things that are happening now still to African Americans, that seems like a truth. Is this World War Civil Rights #3, or which one is it? One of the former governors, no, two governors have said that as a result of the Civil War, we will make life as difficult for those N-words as possible for the future. And there was another one who said, no, we will not give you money, we will give you education. So how is that not still the Civil War?
I think we still have issues. You can't say we haven't come a ways based on my childhood and what I was seeing play out in Jackson. I can vaguely remember, Jackson in my childhood was where you came to shop. Jackson Mall and Metro Center was not here. So if you were going to buy clothes for your kids or whatever, you were coming to downtown Jackson. I can vaguely remember separate entrances for whites and blacks. I can vaguely remember the water fountains. You know, I probably was maybe 3 or 4. You know, I was very young, but people have told me that I've always been a fairly observant person, even as a kid. Do I think we are where we should be or utopia? No, I don't. I think there's still room for improvement. I wish I knew how to bring it about where everybody was on an even playing field, but you know, it's such a almost like a minefield to walk through. Sometimes some of your best intentions will create problems for something else. I'm reading the book about when Bobby Kennedy came to the Delta when everybody was starving. That's one of the books. I usually read like 5 books at once. I'll read one book one day, one book the next. And, you know, their best intentions was to help starving people in the Delta. And at first it wasn't helping. It was hurting more than it was helping. So I think the only way we're going to solve problems is everybody who has a difference actually sit down face to face and talk. I went to Provine. You know, Provine, when I went to Provine, was probably 78 to 80% black. And we had the reputation for racial problems. I'm class of 79. I'm proud to say that my class probably figured it out better than anybody I know. We got along. We didn't see skin color. And, you know, I think when we graduated, we all, like most people do, you go in your separate directions. And you worry about, as you go in your separate directions, you might not be sort of staying clear to what you were at that time. Everybody changes, everybody grows. And I haven't seen most of those people in close to 40 years. We got together this summer to plan our 40th class reunion for next year. And, you know, this is the first time Judy met most of my high school friends. And we're a pretty good group. I see hope in our group. I see hope in my son. I'll give you a quick story about my son. He's in his 20s now, but this is when he was in first grade. And he came home and he was talking about this kid named Marcus. And I had never heard of Marcus. So on the first parent-teacher day, I went to go to parent-teacher day, but while I was there, I asked Patrick, I said, show me Marcus. You talk about him so much. Well, Patrick points at him and he says, he's the kid in the red shirt. Marcus was black. And I think most adults probably would have said he's the black kid over there. But at first grade age, my son saw the shirt color he was wearing, not the color of his skin. And I left that school the proudest father I could be. And I kept saying, maybe it's, you know, although I want to change the world, one reason I became a journalist is to change the world. I'm a big Woodward and Bernstein guy. And, but maybe the way we change the world is how we raise our kids. And they change the world because it's so easy to get in a rut and it's so easy to get in your comfort zone. And I think at times your comfort zone is hanging around what looks like you. And you know, I'm happy to say my neighborhood is whites and blacks. That's perfectly fine with me. I have no problem with that. My neighborhood growing up here in Jackson was that way. And I had neighbors who left because blacks moved into our neighborhood. And I never saw the big deal about it myself. But, you know, I think it's how you're raised. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, to be honest with you. But I think it's how you're raised. I think it's how you raise your kids. And I see hope. I see things that bother me greatly. You know, I don't like to see hatred. I try not to listen to talk radio anymore because it's not worth the airtime that it's spent on it. But I was listening to something that was for a station in New Orleans, and the person was calling a fellow American the enemy. When you view a fellow American as the enemy, I think you're the problem. It's not the other person. And, you know, since I was the author of Civil War books, I had people ask me when I would speak places, and they say, do you think we'd have another Civil War? And at first I would always say, no, we've learned our lesson. But after these past few years, don't want to be Debbie Downer, but yeah, I could see it happening. It may not be in the sense that the old Civil War was, but I could see something happening. Someone asked me a fun question. That was a big one.
I wanted to ask you a question about the water quality down there. You know, sometimes they close the beach in Harrison County. And I know in Jackson County, you know, they've done better with the wastewater and stuff like that. And I'm wondering, you know, you guys are going to get that BP money, a lot of it.
Yeah.
And do you think that Harrison County's going to clean up the water down there?
That's almost as hard as her question was. I hope they do. I just don't know. Every time they try to do something on the drainage on Highway 90, every dip on Highway 90 from Long Beach to Bay St. Louis is right where that drain is, that drains out into the Gulf. I don't know. It would seem to me you wouldn't drain out into the Gulf if you're going to try to improve the water quality. But I'm not an engineer. I can't. You know, they might have a better plan for it than I do. I always shake my head when I see people out on the beach, and they're always by the pipe that's running out into the Gulf. If I was getting in the water, I would be nowhere near that pipe, but that's me.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what type of camera do you use?
I have Nikon gear, primarily because I had Nikon gear back in the film days, and those lenses still fit on the digital. When I was with the Sun Herald, we were Canon, and I loved Canon. In fact, Canon gave us free gear when Katrina hit, and we won a year. We covered Katrina with Canon equipment. We did the aftermath with Canon equipment. Absolutely loved it. I used to call Nikon autofocus instead of autofocus. But Canon, I thought, had it grabbed and focused quicker than Nikon did. To me, Nikon racks back and forth a little bit before it finds its focus. And then a year after Katrina, I thought they were just going to give us the equipment we tore up and said, now pay for it, but they actually gave us new equipment, and we paid for that. Either one, personally, I think if you use Canon or Nikon, other than the fact if you're doing manual focus, everything's backwards. I have a friend who bought one, but I haven't talked to him. He seems to like it, and he's more of a shooting models and weddings type thing. He loves it. So I will say that my friend Brian likes it, but I don't know what kind of endorsement that is.
My question is much simpler. I was wondering, your book or books on the Civil War, how are you able to display that principle, the lost cause? Were you able to display that in pictures in your civil rights book?
It's going to be a challenge. You know, I had a guy at Beauvoir. You know, they can be some of your worst critics on anything Civil War related. And he pulled me aside and he said, I know what you do. He goes, you research it, you put the history out there, and you let the person make the decision. And that has always been my approach. I don't try to sway anybody from one argument to the next. I think everyone out here is intelligent. They can make their own decisions. But I do like to tell history. I always said being a history buff is a blessing and a curse, because it's a blessing that I do have that interest. I have a perspective that other people don't have. But it also, to be like Sheldon Cooper, it makes me want to cry when I see people who don't understand history. So I'm going to try to do it. I mean, it's what I did with the Civil War stuff was that I would take the picture. Hopefully it would grab your interest. I took a picture of Ulysses S. Grant at sunset. It's just a beautiful, stark image with an orange sky. And then I let the words tell the story about Grant. So you sort of taking from the old newspaper approach, I want my picture to sort of grab you. And then I want my words to talk to you and hopefully tell you something that you may have not known, or it might You know, I like to tell history warts and all. You know, if the person's a bad man but a good general, I'll try to say that. You know, he's good in the fight, but you probably don't want to be his friend. And, you know, I think we have a lot of people like that today. But I don't want to run away from the history. I will say that is right now on the Civil Rights book, if someone said the N-word, I included it because that's how they talked then. And I don't want to sugarcoat that. I mean, if there was hatred back then, and I think most of us agree there was a lot of hatred back then it needs to come across. And I have many black friends that I've told them, I want you to read this book before I send it out to the publisher because I want your input. I know what the world looks like from the eyes of a 57-year-old white guy. I want my black friends to tell me whether the book really bothers them. And at that point, you know, I might make changes, I might not. It depends, but I want their input. And it would be stupid of me not to have so many black friends not to get their input. And so before it goes to the publisher, there's going to be more eyes than just Judy's on it because I know her perspective. I know my perspective. I want my friend's perspective. And I'm going to lean on them.
It's a hard read.
It can be a hard read. Yes, sir.
I love your pictures. They were really fantastic.
Thank you.
I would like to know how close did you get to the eagle? The close-up of the eagle? How close were you actually to the eagle? I got a chance to see one in Alaska this year. They are so
They're
beautiful.
impressive, aren't they?
They're beautiful. I didn't know they were that big, but how close were you?
Not as close as it looks like. I had my 300 millimeter on, so I had my big lens on, but I very seldom drive with my moonroof pulled back because what hair I have left, I don't need the sun bleaching it. But I had the moonroof back, I think from the previous night. I'll drive with it at night, I'll close it during the daytime. And I was driving, and it was like this shadow of an airplane comes over. It's almost like I'm looking up to see if the sun went behind a cloud. And when I look up, I see that big white head fly over, and I'm about to run people off the road, getting to find a parking place because that's the first time I ever seen a bald eagle in person. And it was like he knew I wanted to take his picture, so he lit on top of a tree, and I'm getting all the gear ready and all that, and I take a few pictures, and then you can see him pull those feathers back, like the wings back, like he's going to take off, and that's the picture. He did a very majestic takeoff, and then he circled over me, and then it was like he said, "Photo session's over," and he flew off. It helps that, you know, I'll be the first to tell you it's not the equipment, it's the photographer, but it helps to have the equipment too. I mean,
with the demise of newspapers, what's going to happen to these good still pictures of news events that we have gotten from people like you?
It breaks my heart that newspapers are going through what they're going. To throw another song lyric to you, and this isn't from the Doobie Brothers, it's from Chicago. There's a song where it says, "You don't know what you got until it's gone, and then you find out a little too late." That's the way I feel about newspapers. I got many friends in TV industry and love them. They do a good job. But it's sort of 30-second news. If you sit down and actually put the microscope to a TV news broadcast, there's a lot of happy talk, and then you go to commercial, and then there's a little bit more happy talk, and then you go to the weather person. And to deliver news that you might need to know before you elect the next person or this, that, and the other, you need one of those good sit-down, hold the paper in front of you reads. And I don't know what's going to happen when that's not here. To me, newspapers, you sort of think about people say, well, give the reader what they want. Well, TV's done that. They give the viewer what they want, and we got Honey Boo Boo and all kinds of and stuff like that. So I think if you're a journalist, you give the people what they need. They may not actually want it, but they need to read it. And it helps to read bad news as well as good news. And I think we're sugarcoating a lot. I think we're trying to be the most popular kid at the dance, and that's not what journalism's about. It's not about me being your best friend. Hopefully, I respect you, you respect me, but it's not, we're not supposed to be holding hands, tiptoeing through the tulips either. We respect each other, but we're telling the news. And if you're telling the news honestly, then you don't fall into this fake news junk and all that stuff, and you know someone tells the news. My niece, who I adore, she's the only niece I have, but she said one time, she said, media does nothing but tell lies. And that made me so mad, because I had devoted my whole life to being an objective journalist. The old guard, that real old guy over here, he's checking his phone. We wanted to be judged by our objectivity and our accuracy. We weren't there to win an argument. We weren't there to have one side of the political spectrum like us and the other side not. We wanted to be objective. I took pictures of President Bush when he was down at Katrina. I never voted for President Bush. I respect President Bush. I respect him more now for what he did for the coast. And just because I didn't vote for him didn't mean I was going to take a bad picture of it. My job was to get the best picture I could. And I had a visiting journalist after he saw my picture. My picture, he's hugging one girl, and I think he's kissing the top of her head, and she's crying. Which, after Katrina, there's a lot of that. And that front page was shown at the museum up in Washington, D.C. And I had a journalist see the picture, and I'll clean it up for you, but he walked up to me and he said, "You actually made it look like that SOB cared." And it was a compliment, plus it bothered me, because if I made it look like he cared, great. I wasn't there to make it look like he cared or didn't care. I was just recording the image as it happened. I don't know whether President Bush cared or not. I think he did. I mean, it's hard to walk around a town that looks like an atomic bomb went off and not care. So, it's nowadays, as a journalist, you have to win your own personal battles. It's like many battlefields out there. And if you hold true to yourself that you're going to be objective and fair and do the best job you can, that's all you can do. I always tell my son, do your best. And I don't tell him to go out and try to win one side of the argument. I just, do your best. Do what you can do and live with it. And if you can live with it, I can live with it. And I think that's what you do. I hope papers come back. I don't know if sort of like the corporately owned farms, I don't know if corporately owned newspapers can still exist in this world. And it might need to just be local, a bunch of local papers that's not beholden to the big fat money cat who's trying to make a huge profit.
My question relates to the audience here today and the audiences I've seen over the years at these events. We've got older people, me included, of course, mainly at these events, male or female. We have very few, like this young lady to my right here, who's a rising star. Why don't we have younger or middle-aged people? What can we do to change the dynamics of that?
When I was the young kid at the Sun-Herald, to me, I see a sort of a shift. When I was the young kid at the Sun-Herald, no way did I think I knew it all. And we had a deal where this is back when they actually played football games at the Memorial Stadium. And it was Mississippi State and Florida. And we had a deal where you rode with a reporter instead of going in two cars. Well, I didn't know who the reporter was at that point. 2 weeks before the game, I found out the reporter was Dick Lightsey. Well, he was, as I called myself, he was a dinosaur compared to me. I mean, he was probably in his late 50s, maybe 60s. And I remember going, God, I can't believe I got to ride 3 hours with this guy. You know, usually when I rode with other people, we'd put in the music and talk about it or so on and so forth. I don't think Dick Lightsey was a big Doobie Brothers fan, so that wasn't going to be a great ride. And what I found out was that Dick Lightsey was a veteran, and that he could tell me chapter and verse about Pearl Harbor. And it was the best 3-hour drive to a football game I ever had. And years after that, I would find out what games Dick Lightsey would cover, and I would ride with him, because we had a great time. Before I left the Sun Herald, Judy would hear me lament that I didn't think the younger crowd really wanted to hear what we knew. You know, where I was sort of going to people saying, tell me some of your war stories. Not everybody, but I got a sense from some like they already knew it all. And kudos to you for coming and being our young representative, because that's what we need. We need old, young, really young. I mean, everybody. I mean, I think if you can try to make it fun for everybody, I mean, it was easy for me because my lifelong interest has been history. I remember being in kindergarten, and they're talking about Thomas Hines, who this county is named after. And it was something about him floating down the Pearl River in a canoe, and he was laying down so the Indians wouldn't see him. I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. I mean, I wanted to learn more about Thomas Hines. And, you know, I grew up before video games, but just the notion of finding out a little more about that story, I don't know if that was the future journalist in me, and that you gave me a little nugget and I wanted to know a little more. But I think it starts with curiosity. I hope our younger crowd has that curiosity. And I'm here to tell you, it might not be the type story they're looking for, just like my experience with Dick. It might be that they're expecting some boring reply from me and I actually tell them a good story. And then all of a sudden they go, oh, that's good. And they say, Tim's that old guy that will tell you good stories. And then you can sort of go from there.
Well, we have reached the top of another hour. I would like to remind you that we have copies not only of the current book for sale here, but the previous books as well. I hope that we will see you all back here next week when Dr. Rick DeShaza will be our speaker. But help me thank Tim Isbell for this program today.